All right, this is the second lecture for Friday, March 27th. We're looking at intertidal ecosystems, and we're on this topic of the influence of the physical and biological conditions on organisms that you find there. So what kind of conditions are there? There's certainly biological conditions. As I mentioned before, the closer you get to water, then the less extreme, the less harsh, the less difficult it is for organisms to deal with physical conditions, and the easier it is for everybody to live there. And so you have a lot more organisms there, you have a lot more competition, and in many cases you have a lot more predator-prey interactions that are shaping you. So it's biological factors as you move towards the water. As you move away from the water, it's these kind of conditions listed here. And these types of gradients that you find that are becoming more and more difficult for organisms to tolerate as you move away from the water. So during low tide, when you're out of the water, now that's not an easy time to live. You're exposed to air, you're exposed to predators, you're exposed to fresh water sometimes if it rains or if you're in a mud puddle. So you have challenges with thermal regulation, you have challenges with osmoregulation, you have challenges with being eaten. When the water comes up, then you're underwater. You can extract oxygen, you can feed, you can osmoregulate, no problem, and you can get rid of your wastes. Now, so when you're underwater, now that's easy. You're really back to being a marine organism. So as you move away from the water, you find more and more organisms that are really good at tolerating stressful habitats. As you move closer and closer to the water, you find more organisms that are not necessarily good at tolerating stress, but they're really good competitors. So another thing that you find in some of these intertidal ecosystems, there's a lot of water movement. Others that we'll see, they're pretty calm water, and that's what typifies these intertidal ecosystems, is that they're found in calm water. But there's movement of water is something that some of these places you have to deal with. The waves are crashing on the rocks, the waves are crashing on the sand. There's strong currents, there's strong tidal currents. So one thing that you see in these intertidal ecosystems, very common, is you've got to be able to withstand the forces of waves crashing on you, and you've got to be able to attach yourself to the substrate. So if you look at all these different intertidal organisms, they have some mechanisms for attaching to the rocks, whether you're talking about algae or you're talking about some animal. Or they have ways of attaching to whatever sediment they're in or on with their rhizomes and the way that they attach in soft sediment or where they're found within soft sediment. It's not all bad if you live in an area where there's a lot of water movement, because the water movement, it helps you move around, especially in terms of reproduction. It brings oxygen, it brings food. So there's advantages for being in calm water, especially in terms of staying in place. But there's certainly advantages for being in areas where there's a lot of water movement. Pluses and minuses for all this water movement. However, the organisms you see in the rocky shore have adaptations that allow them to deal with waves crashing and strong water movements. And the organisms you find in mangroves and places where the water currents hardly move at all, very different. Okay, well, let's start our survey of intertidal ecosystems. For today, we can go through a few of these, but these are the ones that we're going to look at. And we already looked at mud flats, and we looked at seagrass meadows, and we looked at oyster reefs in terms of communities that you find associated with estuaries. Now we're going to look at salt marshes, mangroves, lagoons, and channels, all of which are also associated with estuaries in some cases, but there's a lot of salt marshes, there's a lot of mangroves that are not associated with estuaries at all. So they're not really in the same category as those three that we looked at before. And these are more properly entire ecosystems than the communities that we were considering, the three that we looked at earlier when we were talking about estuaries. But you could consider those communities or ecosystems as well. So anyway, let's look at salt marshes, mangroves. If you throw in seagrasses, seagrass meadows that we looked at before, those are the three types of flowering plants that we looked at earlier in the semester. Then there's lagoons and channels, which are really they're more geographical features, but they're separate bodies of water from the ocean, from the main part of the ocean, and they have their own set of conditions, their own set of physical conditions, and, not surprisingly, their own characteristic organisms that are found there as well. So let's start with salt marshes. In Rhode Island, there's a lot of salt marshes. In New Jersey, a lot of salt marshes. New York, a lot of salt marshes, all the way down the U.S. East Coast, especially in these soft sediment areas. Virginia, all the way down, even in Florida, there's a lot of salt marsh grasses. Now, if we were in school in person, you'd be going out to the salt marsh on one of your field trips. It's really unfortunate you're not able to go on these field trips, because that's really, besides these lectures, the highlight of the class are the field trips. So in terms of being an intertidal ecosystem, these salt marshes are characterized by zonation. If you're standing at the water at the low tide mark and you're looking around and seeing what kind of plants are there, if you documented the types of plants, the species, and how big they are, and the distribution of those, and you started walking away from the water towards the vans, towards the road, you'd start to notice that the vegetation changes. There's different heights of the plants, there's different species of plants. And that's what we would observe during our field trip. But we're not going to. Some of the grasses you find there's all these different cord grasses. There's rushes, there's spike grass, there's pickleweed. And so if you think about the physical features close to the water, when the tide comes up, you're underwater more. The tide goes down, you're underwater for a short period of time. The farther you move away from the water, the more you're exposed, and the harsher that environment is. The closer you are to the water, the less you're exposed, and the more biological challenges that you face with competition, predator-prey interactions. And so you see zonation. You see very distinct zonation. What you guys were going to do is take your tape measures and lay those tape measures out from the water moving towards shore and look at the types of plants you see there. And you'd see there's drastic changes from one zone to the next. There's really very distinct zones where you find some type of plants close to the water and other types of plants farther away from the water. And eventually you get to the point where you're no longer in the salt marsh, but you're basically on land. So there's a picture of salt marsh. There's salt marshes that look like this in Rhode Island, all up and down the East Coast. Depending on where you're from, you probably have salt marshes like this, except for if you're from Tennessee, maybe not. And then there's a diagram that shows the low marsh and the high marsh and the different types of plants that you find there. So to the left of that drawing, you're close to the water, and you get farther and farther away. Eventually you get to terrestrial plants. And so there's these changes that are quite distinct sometimes when you move away from the water. That's the type of zonation that you would find. So if the environmental conditions, if the biological conditions demonstrate a gradient moving away from the water, and you have a gradient or zonation of plants as well, not surprising that animals would be affected by this zonation and affected by this combination of biological and physical features as well. So there's some primary producers that are fed upon by animals, but not much. So most of these salt marsh grasses, they're not eaten because they have a high cellulose content. They store silica in their tissues, which makes it, for an animal, it makes it kind of like eating the sand. So just as we saw with all these flowering plants, really, including the seagrasses, these plants die, they sink to the bottom, they get worked on by decomposers, they enter into the food webs, a lot of organic matter, a lot of nutrients, but the form that they enter these food webs is as detritus. So that there is a big input. There's a lot of primary production. However, most of that primary production isn't eaten by animals, like a lot of plants on land, where all kinds of different parts of plants are eaten. But it makes its way, they make their way into food webs through bacteria and through decomposers. Another aspect of these salt marsh grasses, they're not really high, it's not like a 12-foot high band of grass, but they're a couple of feet high. So it's really a three-dimensional habitat. There's a lot of settling organisms, a lot of things that attach to the seagrass. And again, the closer you are to the water, the more of these things are underwater. The farther away from the water, then the more they have to tolerate desiccation and temperature changes and those kind of things. These salt marsh grasses trap sediments. They alter the movement of water, and so they create this habitat, this soft sediment that's very good for a lot of burrowing organisms. There's a lot of crabs, and there's bivalve mollusks as well. Some of the salt marshes you go to around New England, you're walking on these mussels all the time. Not mussels that are attached to the rocks, but mussels that are burrowing in this soft sediment. So what do you find there? Mussels, these mollusks, amphipods, those crustaceans, snails, those are gastropod mollusks, a lot of crabs, crustaceans. And then there's clams that are mollusks, shrimp that are crustaceans, and there's polychaetes, those annelid worms, segmented worms. Then you've got a lot of birds, you've got a lot of fish. Fish are all over these. They have to stay in the water, of course, but they're associated with salt marsh grasses. So it's a very productive habitat for a number of different things, and just fish and invertebrates that are considered as part of fisheries. Huge amount of money in the U.S. anyway. Well, let's look at the second one, mangroves. Now, this is another plant. Earlier in the semester, we looked at these primary producers that were flowering plants. And we looked at seagrasses. We checked that off. We did those earlier. We looked at salt marsh grasses. We just finished that. And now we're on to this third type of flowering plant. There's a number of different species, but they're mangrove trees. Now, this isn't some little seagrass that's 6 inches tall. It's not some little marsh grass that's 2 feet tall. These are trees that could be 20 feet tall or 30 feet tall. And it's an interesting interface between terrestrial ecosystems and aquatic ones, because basically these mangrove trees above the water, like a terrestrial ecosystem, below the water, you've got all these roots, this root system. It's a very complex three-dimensional marine ecosystem. And this is intertidal. Now, you don't find these, same with the salt marsh grass, you don't find these where there's a lot of wave action. Calm water around the tropics, very common, as we saw when we were looking at these as the plants rather than the ecosystems that they create. Saw that they line a huge part of the ocean. 2/3 of tropical coastlines in the world are lined by mangroves. What we're doing as humans, we're going in and systematically removing these mangroves so that there can be beaches there. We like to go to the beach. There's somebody sitting in a mangrove tree. They look very happy, but that's not where you're going to go and hang out when you're on vacation. So there's a lot of them that are removed for beaches, nice sandy beaches. There's a lot of them in Asia that are removed for different types of developments, including shrimp aquaculture, shrimp farms. So widely distributed, very characteristic. And in terms of mangroves, or these mangles, or the communities, mangrove is an entire ecosystem. As you recall, communities make up ecosystems, or if you take the physical and biological components of an area, that constitutes an ecosystem rather than a community. So what's eating mangrove plants? Not very much. What's eating their leaves? Not very much. The roots? Not very much. Their stems? Hardly anything. They, big primary producers, channel a lot of light energy to chemical energy, store that. They die, they sink to the bottom, their leaves sink to the bottom. There's a lot of input of dead, decaying matter from these mangrove trees, decomposed, broken down by bacteria, and then they enter food webs. They have a bunch of leaves, much more so than those salt marsh grasses and seagrasses, more properly leaves like you see on a tree as opposed to grass. And so it's like a bunch of leaves that fall into the forest. Those leaves in the forest eventually turn into soil. They make up soil. They make up the organic portion of soil. Same thing here. And so there's a lot of energy that enters as detritus, yes, but it's still a lot of energy. There's roots, or this whole ecosystem. It's protection. It's a place to settle if you're a sponge or a brachiopod or something like that, a bryozoan, some invertebrate. Good place to settle. Good place for protection if you're a little fish. So it's an important habitat for both invertebrates, for mobile species, for sessile species. And in the sediment around these mangroves, there's a lot of crabs, there's a lot of detritus feeders that are burrowing. There's a whole bunch of different organisms that are found around these mangroves in the sediments, just a little ways away from the mangroves. So these are really common, especially in the tropics. And this is the third flowering plant that we've looked at. Again, early in the semester, we're looking at these plants in terms of how they deal with living in and around the ocean. Why are they so common and other types of plants aren't? This focus is on these three different types of plants, flowering plants, as ecosystems and the role that they play in marine ecosystems as intertidal marine ecosystems. So that will take us to these next couple that, again, they're physical parts that are set aside from the rest of the ocean, and they have their own characteristic habitats and their own characteristic organisms. That's what we'll continue on with on Monday.